Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. All right, on today's episode, we have on Scott Sehon to discuss his book, Socialism, A Logical Introduction. This interview was set up by our mutual friend and friend of the show, multiple-time guest, Kristen Gotze. And I always, respect and trust her. And she's like, here's my friend. Do you think you guys would have a great time? And we did. This was a really fun conversation, lots of laughs. But also we get into the logical, systematic argumentation for socialism. And we take on the common arguments that are advanced by capitalists and liberals of various sorts for the superiority of capitalism and the inferiority of socialism. We take them head on. The book is all about systematically working through those arguments to reveal their premises, to critique them, to strip them down to their bare parts and analyze them. And I think it's a really fascinating and helpful thing to do for those of us interested in moving this world in a socialist direction. So it's going to be a really, really fun episode. I'm really excited for it. I also want to remind people that we have an ongoing collaboration with our friends over at leftwingbooks.net associated with Kerspleblideb Publishing, wherein Rev Left listeners can get 15% off any book in their library. And they have an ever-growing library of left-wing Marxist, socialist, feminists, anti-colonial, decolonial, anti-imperialist books of theory, of history, biographies of certain individuals, etc. And it's a wonderful, wonderful outlet for people to go and get books. And now if you're a Rev Left listener, just click the link in the show notes. We already have the code embedded. It's you can type in, I think, Rev Left at checkout, but we'll just give you the link. So once you click it, that already automatically applies. You automatically get your 15% off, and you can get easier access, more affordable access to a wonderful amount of books. So we really appreciate our comrades over at Left Wing Books, and we support what they're doing. They support what we're doing. It's a perfect match. So if you haven't already taken advantage of that, definitely give it thoughts. Go check them out. Go support them. It's a wonderful thing. All right, without further ado, here is my discussion with Professor of Philosophy Scott Sehon on his recent book, Socialism, A Logical Introduction. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here. My name is Scott Sehon. I'm a professor of philosophy at Bowdoin College in Maine and have been there teaching for quite a while, about 30 years, teaching logic and other areas of philosophy, but also recently a course called Socialism, Capitalism, and Democracy.
Oh, nice. You actually teach a class entitled that, huh?
Yes.
That's very interesting. Cool. Well, I'm very happy to have you on. The book we're going to be discussing today is, of course, Socialism, A Logical Introduction. I always enjoy having philosophers on the podcast because I myself come from a philosophy background, just a bachelor's degree in philosophy, but still it's always been a core interest of me and a sort of a core theme of this podcast. We even cover philosophy outside of politics proper, but it's always fun to have a philosopher in on the show, and so we're going to cover this book with you today. And I guess the first question I want to ask, and just to also help listeners orient themselves to the book and the discussion, is kind of what was your impetus behind writing this book, and what were you hoping to accomplish with it?
Yes, and it was an odd history in some ways. A lot of my previous work in philosophy has been on much more metaphysical, abstruse questions, free will and nature of the mind-body problem and that sort of thing. This book came about after I co-authored an article for Aeon magazine with anthropologist Kristen Gotze, where the article was titled Anti-Communism. And part of the article was talking about the responses. There had been a spate of anti-communist arguments that were not particularly good ones. And Kristen's part in that article was to raise various ethnographic data and various empirical problems that ended up infecting the anti-communist arguments. My part was to break down their argument into careful and explicit steps and thereby be able to show why their argument might be appealing and yet why it seemed to go wrong, and that if you fixed it up this way, then it went wrong for this reason. If you fixed it up another way, it went wrong for that reason. that sort of argumentative analysis that we do in philosophy all the time. And it was surprising to me that the article was shared thousands of times on Facebook, and it basically occurred to me, wow, I'm certainly very interested in these issues more broadly and have taught some of this sort of material, and maybe there's room here for a much more lengthy treatment where I break down the arguments for and against socialism in the contemporary context, not really attempting to do much justice to the rich history of the topic, and just try to see what we can gain from this process, and in the end, arguing for moving in the socialist direction. What I'm hoping to accomplish with it is for people on the left that they better understand the reasons and arguments for their own position, and perhaps better understand at least the motives and arguments of those who do oppose them, even if I then take pains to try to show where those arguments go wrong. I'm also, in a lot of ways, aiming at people more in the center or even far right or libertarians. I often had in mind the sort of young libertarian who's really impressed by the arguments for libertarianism. And I think some of those can be flipped. I think they can come to see reason and realize that their arguments, tempting though they are, don't work, and that actually the arguments lean much more in the direction of socialism.
Wonderful. Yeah. One, I've always been a really strong advocate on this show of engaging with people who disagree with us fundamentally, engaging with their opinions, understanding where they come from. And I feel like that is a core advantage for any position holder, to understand deeply your various opponents' critiques of you. And I think one of the advantages of being on the socialist and communist left is that so many of our opponents have never really had, because of the ambient ideological background of American society for the last 100 years, have not really had to seriously engage with our arguments, such that it's very easy to go on Fox News or MSNBC or in the pages of the New York Times and, or on Real Time with Bill Maher, and make the laziest sort of hand-waving, anti-communist, quote-unquote arguments that are just so silly and infantile. And it clearly betrays their lack of engagement with the actual tradition. So it's always our advantage to understand our various opponents' viewpoints deeply. And then also, I think it's really what I like about this book, and what I think is really important about it, is that there are many ways that we can engage on the terrain of political opposition and debate. And often, people that disagree with us on the socialist left, they will say that we're just driven by pure ideology, or some of them will argue that, we're just very emotional, or various caricatures, or that, what you often hear is that we just really want power. And so what we do is we hide behind this, ostensibly mass-driven politics and this ostensible care for the poor and the working class, but really all we are, greedy tyrants in waiting. We just want our hands on power. And that flies for serious argumentation in mainstream American discourse, unfortunately.
Yes.
But, with a figure like you bringing this very logical, philosophical engagement with these arguments and breaking them down and sorting through them, I think that is very helpful. And it can help young people coming up who embrace, socialism or left-wing politics, but maybe, could use some of that ammunition, to go to debate and actually have, interesting and deep things to say. Before we move on, though, you mentioned libertarianism, and I'm sure as a college professor, I'm sure as a philosophy professor, you get your fair share of young libertarians coming up, and I wonder if that's changed over the years, because I have this sense that neoliberalism, this period of American life for the last 40 or 50 years, reigned in since Reagan at least, is this period of more or less applied libertarianism, where the ideas of somebody like Milton Friedman really took hold and were pushed ideologically by Reagan, and then were accepted by third-way Clintonism and have become the more or less dominant mainstream norm. Of course, it's not pure libertarianism, because I don't think pure libertarianism can even function, but it's applied libertarianism, and many core ideas from a figure like Milton Friedman were ushered in under Reagan. And that period of time is coming to an end. A lot of people, right, left, and center, maybe not center, but right and left, are becoming more skeptical Have you noticed a difference in the amount of people engaging with, as advocates for libertarianism, or is it more or less stayed the same?
Well, I don't have any systematic data, but yes, I think that there's something to what you say, that there's probably been a little bit less of a tendency towards it now, but still, it's a strong undercurrent, and with college students as well, even though it is true that by and large, college campuses are bastions of liberalism and not this sort of neoliberalism, and they, generally the students are on the left, but not by any means all. Mm-hmm. And there is a substantial sort of Milton Friedman-esque libertarian current. Not that most of the students these days have read Milton Friedman or know much of anything about him, but it has been just kind of absorbed into the culture, as you say, since Reagan.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm very interested to see how that plays out in the coming years, because I even see figures on the right wing now being, explicitly against libertarianism. Tucker Carlson, for example, has come out against libertarianism, and there's this new right movement that is very skeptical and even disdainful of libertarianism. So we'll see how that plays out. But let's get back to the question and to your book. Now, this is, of course, coming from a socialist perspective, and as a Marxist myself, I personally tend to see socialism as this transitionary stage out of capitalism and toward communism. And I believe you identify in the book as a sort of democratic socialist. So I'm wondering if we have any disagreement on this front. So what do you make of this conception of socialism as this transition out of capitalism and explicitly toward communism? And what are your core criteria, as a second point, for meeting the standard of what qualifies as socialism, despite maybe some different interpretations of what it could mean?
Okay, yeah, let me start with the second part of that question, because I think it helps to inform the first part. My criteria for meeting the standard of socialism, well, or at least how I define socialism, I am a couple of things. One is, first, I hope not to get too hung up over words and have semantic disputes replacing substantive disputes. I'd always rather prefer that we argue about substance rather than about who gets to use what word to describe their view. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, given that, and this sort of goes along with that, I see these various different positions as largely being matters of degree. And in particular, I see the degrees on a couple of different axes. We can have differing degrees of how egalitarian our distribution of resources is, and such that, complete egalitarian distribution, or the Marxist idea of from each according to ability to each according to need, would be, the high version of that. Allowing extreme versions of inequality would be the opposite direction. The other axis would be the degree of collective control that we democratically have over the economy, whether that means directly through owning and operating the means of production, or just highly regulating it. But, these things come in degrees as well. And basically my idea is, and, just in terms of how I want to use the term socialism, is that the further we move in those directions, the more egalitarian, more collective control of the economy directions on these two axes, the further we are moving in the direction of socialism. So that's just sort of my background. As for the core criteria, there are certainly those who would say, no, it doesn't count as socialism unless you basically have no profit motive anymore, and you take, you have collective ownership of the means of production and nobody owning and walking away with profit. That is, you can use the word that way if you want. I think it's, again, as long as we are clear on substance, who gets to use what word is less of a concern of mine. Now, back to your question, the first part of the question about seeing socialism as a transition out of capitalism and towards communism. I am basically arguing in the book for moving in the socialist direction as being better, where this means that we have more democratic collective control of the economy through a reasonably strong state, and more egalitarian distribution of resources, again, done through a state. It's possible that one could see that as a transition to something one might call communism, where there's a withering away of the state and there's a much more sort of anarchist picture. And that's possible. That could happen. It could be that if we move far enough in the socialist direction that something different and even better could arise from such a withering away of the state. I myself am a little bit dubious about that. I tend to think that in a world with nearly 8 billion people, we are going to need states to stop extreme inequalities, to regulate and control what will have to be a complex economy to handle the bad apples, to provide infrastructure support, that sort of thing. But I will admit that I don't consider much about that in the book, about sort of moving even further in these directions. The book is mainly aimed at understanding the arguments for socialism against capitalism, and I hope to convince those, inclined towards capitalism that socialism's a better way of going. So I would hope that people like you who see socialism as a transition to something quite different will at least see me as an ally. And even if we may disagree on where the endpoints are, the left does have this unfortunate tendency to form circular firing squads.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're certainly an ally and a friend. No worries there. I just think it is sort of an interesting question. And I think that there's also a big question mark where socialism leads, of where organizing society in that direction can ultimately lead. There are, Marx's sort of core predictions of stateless, moneyless, classless society, but that's still a very sort of vague, set of sentences, and it's not necessarily a full and complete picture, because it can't be, because we're in the historical fog of our own time, and that seems to be far away from where we currently are. One of the things that I think about with communism is not necessarily the statelessness of the endpoint, but more of like, can humanity transcend class society? Can humanity transcend the dividing of human beings up into various classes, where some are in the elite with wealth and power, and others have to toil their entire lives, right? That's true under slave societies. That's true under feudal societies. That's true under capitalist societies. Albert Einstein called all of this the predatory phase of human development. And I think that leaves open the possibility that we can mature as a species beyond class societies in all their forms. So just food,
I think
for
that's
thought.
actually quite, just sorry to interrupt and make one point about that. It's not just a matter of maturing. There's a good deal of evidence that our evolutionary ancestors lived in very egalitarian societies without much by way of class structure. So there's one might even say that we have imposed this upon humanity, and now, if we can get further away from it, we would all be better off. But that would mean perhaps going back to an earlier stage of where we were.
Yeah, I think it was Marx who talked about that as kind of returning to the community at a higher level. Like, there's that pre-class society formation of very egalitarian social structures with the introduction of the agricultural revolution and, human civilization. We immediately go into now the realm of class society. And it's not so much that we want to go back to being hunters and gatherers, right? But it's that we want to come through these periods of human development, this sort of adolescence of our species, if you will, and come out the other side, having gone through that experience and returning to that sort of egalitarian communal structure, but at a much higher level and a much more technologically developed level. So, interesting. Just as a quick aside before we get deeper into this, do you see a meaningful difference personally between social democracy and democratic socialism? Do you think about the tensions there, or where there may be meaningful distinctions? Not in this book, but just personally.
Yeah. Sure. There's obviously the traditional distinction here is that with social democracy, you still have markets, you still have private ownership, but you have a very strong social welfare state. And with socialism, the traditional classical view is that to count as genuinely socialist and not just social democracy, you basically need to get rid of private ownership of the means of production and get rid of, the profit-making motive. Now, there can be different variations on that. And again, I don't really like arguing about words and who gets to use which word. Does it not count as socialism unless you have no private profit and no markets at all? I'd just rather be clear on the substance of what we're talking about. So, but all that said, the traditional picture of social democracy is, it's perhaps at a different point on these two axes that I'm envisioning. It's less far and up to the left than classic socialism. The question of how far we should go, I do still think of as matters of degrees, and I think it's largely, it's in large part an empirical question. There are moral aspects to this question underlying it, but what's best for us? What's best for human well-being? And if I'm at least open to the possibility that what's best for human well-being is something that a lot of people would call social democracy rather than what they would call democratic socialism, I also tend to think that so far it seems to me that the arguments and the evidence point to moving quite far in the socialist direction, something beyond perhaps what people would traditionally call social democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that sort of metric that you use of what's best for human well-being, I think that in and of itself, I think, is a really important metric, because that is not the metric of capitalism. It is not interested in any way of increasing human well-being generally. It's very interested in producing higher levels of well-being and material wealth for a relatively small group of people. But this idea that we could orient our entire society around not profit accumulation and market competition, but around human flourishing and human well-being and human standards of living, I think that in and of itself is a shift away from capitalist realism and modes of capitalist thought. But yeah, I appreciate and agree with your point, especially about degrees and moving in certain degrees. The social democracies of like Northern Europe, for example, are also products of socialist and communist struggles over the last century, right? They are sort of the fruit of a certain sort of left-wing radical tradition and struggle that settled into social democracy as we now know it. But absent those more radical movements for more robust forms or higher degrees of socialism, social democracy itself wouldn't even exist. And so, yeah, interesting. Everything is sort of tied together in that way. But you mentioned morality, and I think that's a great segue to this next question. I have long thought that when people debate big ideas or systems, what they are really debating are core moral values, which often get obscured in the war of marshalling facts. Other Marxists have at times downplayed the relevance of morality in favor of structuralist and historical lines of argumentation. What role does morality play in the capitalism versus socialism debate as you see it? And after that, maybe you can talk about what you refer to in the book as the master arguments for capitalism and socialism.
Right. Yes, I do think that the issue is fundamentally a moral one. The question, after all, is how ought we to structure our economy, our society? And that is inevitably a moral question. It's a question about what we ought to do. It's not just a question about history and what will happen or what people happen to want, that sort of thing. And I think it's important to recognize that. I think there are some, perhaps more on the left than the right, who shy away from talking about moral values, and some in the Marxist tradition, but also just more generally. And perhaps that's because they're afraid to think that there might be anything objective that one could say here. They might think that everything is relative, or perhaps they buy into the Kool-Aid from the religious right and somehow think that the only way of being in favor of moral values is if you thump the Bible and go on about the alleged sins of abortion and homosexuality. As an aside, I'll think that those on the right who talk this way would get a better moral education if they would stop thumping that Bible and actually read it.
Right.
But that's a different matter.
Absolutely.
I also don't think that one needs any particular religious commitments to be a moral and morally thoughtful person. But the big point is that I do think it's a big mistake to cede talk of moral values to the right. When we on the left are concerned, when we're concerned about the well-being of poor people struggling to survive in a land of extreme wealth, that is a moral concern. I don't think there's any other way to put it as far as that goes. And that does play into what you mentioned, what I call my master argument for socialism. One could also have an analogous argument for capitalism. But, I think the one for socialism works better. So what I call the master argument for socialism, and this is what I do in the book a lot, I break these things down into explicit numbered steps. Mm-hmm. And this is the third step of that argument, but since we've been talking about the moral matters here, I would say that as a general premise that is effectively moral, about morality, I would say, given two styles of governance, if the first better promotes human well-being than the second does, and does not violate the moral rights of individuals, then we should do that. We should aim to better promote human well-being so long as we are not violating rights. The other premises of the master argument are just that socialism does that better than extant alternative styles of governance, better than U.S.-style capitalism in particular, and that socialism doesn't violate the moral rights of individuals. So it follows from those three premises that we should be choosing socialism. We should be moving in that direction. But that premise about what type of system we ought to choose is a fundamentally moral one, and I don't think we should shy away from that sort of talk.
I genuinely completely agree with that. And your point when you said, that there's this tendency to cede moral values to the right, I think that's true, and it needs to be combated. And I do think it's a product of what you alluded to, which is this moral relativism that seeps into, I think, mostly probably the liberal left. I think there's a little bit more moral clarity and a tradition of certain moral lines of argumentation that align with the structuralist and historical lines of argumentation over on the Marxist left, socialist left. But for sure, there's a certain moral relativism on the left that makes people reticent to make universal moral claims. And in comparison to that sort of waffling moral relativism, it makes the right seem like they have moral certitude on their side. And that is very appealing to people, and the right wing to this very day, will often play into this idea that they have, the moral certitude on their side, and then on the left it's anything goes and nothing really matters, a sort of nihilism of moral relativism, and it can be alluring for people ideologically to be captured by that line of argument. But I agree with you that we can't escape morality when we're talking about how to build societies. The moral is inevitable. We bump into it, and in fact, the way that I've long said that when you're trying to convince somebody of like socialist politics, socialist values, of course you resort to moral argumentation. If you're just talking to like a regular person and you're trying to convince them of the superiority of socialism compared to capitalism, or just trying to critique capitalism, how could you not talk about the lack of health care? How could you not talk about brutal imperialism? How could you not talk about the injustices of stealing people's excess surplus value and not raising wages while profits go through the roof? Morality is seeped into this entire thing. And I think it's foolhardy to try to avoid that. That doesn't mean we should not advance the structuralist and historical, lines of argumentation, but that they should all go together, and we should have our own moral vision that we stand on and that we are proud of and that we advance along with our broader politic. And I think that's crucial if we're going to have any chance of defeating the right.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, we were talking about human well-being, and one major argument for capitalism, sort of amusingly to people like me and you, but they marshal it quite often, is that capitalism itself has dramatically increased human well-being. Specifically, it's increased human well-being through prosperity and the generation of massive amounts of wealth and the ostensible and real material progress that people have seen from monarchical feudalism to today's 21st century techno-capitalism. And so one of the first arguments you'll hear when you're debating a capitalist is, look at what capitalism has done. Look at you typing on your iPhones and on your computers criticizing capitalism, right? How could you? But you argue that capitalism and free markets are actually not the drivers of these particular gains in prosperity and wealth and material progress. So can you kind of elaborate on that argument? And if it's not capitalism and free markets proper, what is the main driver of these gains?
Right. Yes. And one thing I'll say, to caution against, not that you were doing this, but I think the capitalists in making this argument are right about a couple of things. One is that there has been a significant increase in overall human well-being over the past couple of centuries in contrast with the centuries before that. Not just for the super wealthy. I mean, life expectancy has gone way up. We live in levels, even those of us who are not incredibly rich live in levels of well-being and prosperity that would be the envy of kings in earlier generations. And it is also true that this increase in well-being correlates roughly with the rise of capitalism as an economic system. All of that's, I think, true, and one shouldn't try to deny it because you'll basically have a tough time denying some of the facts involved there, though one can certainly quibble about many of the details. But in any event, correlation is not causation. It's the fact that there has been this increase in well-being over the past couple of centuries, and capitalism has come to more and more dominate. That's a correlation. That doesn't show that this is explaining that. Mm-hmm. An example that I use to show the correlation is not always causation. Since Putin took power in Russia, Major League Baseball salaries have gone way up. But I don't think any Major League Baseball player is worried that if Putin were to lose power, that their salaries would go down. It's just obviously in that case, it's a spurious correlation. In the case of the rise in well-being in the United States and other countries like that in the West in general, and capitalism, one reason to go against the claim that it's causation in addition to correlation is that the countries in Western Europe and Northern Europe that are further in the direction of the socialist side of the spectrum tend to be happier than people in the United States, and they tend to have better measures of well-being in a lot of respects. In addition, they simply report being happier. There can be lots of explanations for that, of course, but it would be surprising if it is capitalism that explains the gains in well-being. There's also the interesting fact that the Soviet bloc countries in the, from 1917 to 1991, thereabouts, that, they don't count as democratic socialist on my view because it wasn't genuine collective control. They were totalitarian. That, I'm not advocating those systems, but they weren't capitalist in terms of how they organized the economy. And yet the data that we have, the data are imperfect, but the data that we have said, they had a lot of economic growth. Their life expectancy increased dramatically. Yes, by 1989, 1991, they were still behind us, but they started much lower than the Western European countries and the United States. And yet they managed to more or less keep pace. That is utterly mysterious on the claim, the capitalist claim, that it is capitalism that explains the rise in overall human well-being. And now it's the capitalist who has to try to explain away this apparent exception to their claim. I think, just stepping back, you asked what the real driver was here. I think, there was the scientific revolution. We have antibiotics. We have all kinds of things that science has provided, yes, including iPhones and things like that, the computer technology that arose out of fundamental scientific discoveries first. We've had scientific revolution and scientific progress that I don't think is attributable to capitalism, and that's what really explains the great increase in human well-being over the last couple of centuries. And so it's not due to capitalism.
Yeah, I find that incredibly convincing and absolutely true. And there's this two-sided nature of capitalism that pro-capitalists like to ignore, which is, and Marx kind of got at it when he was looking at industrial capitalism in the 19th century, and he says, how can a system increase its wealth while at the same time increasing its misery? And there's a sense in which the more materially prosperous, quote unquote, at least the West gets, and we have discussions of colonialism and imperialism embedded in this as well, with regards to how certain parts of the world became incredibly rich and other parts of the world are systematically underdeveloped. But, for those of us in the West, we're living through, mental health crises like never before seen. We're living through periods of intense alienation. One of the things I do as sort of a sociological interest of mine is I go on YouTube and I look up Gen Z talking to themselves about their situation, about their lack of a future, about what their take on society is, and how they feel utterly and completely devoid of meaning and purpose and a life plan. And it really drives home this point that this cohort of young people coming up right behind my generation are suffering deeply, and there's a sense in which capitalism itself is antithetical and hostile to some basic You were talking about, evolutionary biology earlier, some basic impulses in our nature as human beings, which is to be social creatures, to fit into, a social ecosystem, to have a sense of community. And those things have been systematically stripped away by capitalism. So for the pro-capitalist saying we have these wonderful improvements of well-being, your scientific and technological argument is absolutely crucial. But we can also cast a skeptical eye on that claim because, raw material progress for some is not necessarily the exact same thing as higher levels of well-being. And in fact, studies prove that at a certain point of material well-being, getting more material stuff does absolutely nothing to move the dial with regards to happiness and life satisfaction. So certainly, like in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there's a certain level of material prosperity and wealth that a human being in a society need to be comfortable. But beyond that, billions of dollars, 3 yachts, multiple houses, right? While other people are sleeping on the streets. I mean, that's the sort of grotesquerie of the system.
Yes.
But I do have another point to make, and I kind of want to bounce this idea off of you. And this is all in the spirit of friendly, comradely discussion. You do have a sort of a little bit less sympathetic take on the Soviet Union than I might have. And you I think correctly point to the fact that over time this system, despite its ideological pretensions, did seem to move away from democracy and more towards more authoritarian perhaps ways of structuring society. And I would offer this to you, and I would love to get your thoughts on this. There's a couple of things at play here with regards to why that happened. The first thing is that when you're transitioning to a whole new way of doing things, right, this attempt to move into socialism for the first time ever is like the first attempt to move out of monarchical feudalism towards capitalism or towards mercantilism, right? It's never going to be in one big jump we get there. It's going to be, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. It's going to be met with counter-revolution. Think of the French Revolution and the reaction to Europe after that. Napoleon's crusade throughout the entire European continent, spreading Republican values and how much he was fucking hated for that by all the kings of Europe, etc. So there's that part of it, that historical progress, it takes many iterations to make a jump. There's also the history of, let's look at Russian history, right? This is a history of Tsarism. There's no democratic culture in Russia at this point, right? We're looking at Tsar Nicholas, and 1,000 years prior, we're looking at these really authoritarian monarchical systems of domination and hierarchy that are really unquestioned. And to take a society from that and to try to move them, not even just to bourgeois parliamentarianism and, liberalism, but to even take it further to actually like we should own the workplaces, that's a lot to ask of a culture and a society that doesn't have a lot of history with that, right? The default is to go back to sort of some version of a strongman, and then the third part is, of course, being immediately attacked. So the moment that the Soviet Union came to be, moment the revolution was successful, we immediately descend into the Civil War. We have 14 of the strongest European and American countries coming in, trying to strangle the baby in its crib. Then we lead to the Cold War, where there's threats of nuclear annihilation just for a society trying to orient itself around a different set of principles. And that also results in having to cut back on democratic flourishing, on experimentation, because you have to take a defensive posture and sort of, fight for your life just to continue existing. So what do you make of kind of those arguments from somebody who might be slightly more sympathetic to the Soviet system?
Yes, I can certainly understand that perspective, and I agree with most of what you just said there. They started with some tremendous obstacles towards trying to adopt a socialist society, which was, at least they had the very noble goals. Even, Marx basically thought, it has to go through capitalism first. They kind of skipped that part. They just had, this feudal system, and then tried to go straight into a socialist system. And so that was going to be extremely difficult. And yes, and then you're quite right. They, having this being attacked on all sides and strangled on all sides, made it even harder for that system to work. Whether they, apart from some of these considerations, whether the people involved there could have settled into what I would have thought of as a more egalitarian, economically, they weren't that far from being fairly egalitarian, but more, democratic, a system where there was genuine collective control rather than, a strongman at the top or a narrow committee of Politburo members that basically controlled everything. That's a very interesting question, just historically counterfactual question. What would have happened? You had the Soviet Union, first of all, started with a bit more of a background in democracy than they had under the Tsar, which was essentially zero, of course. And what would have happened without the opposition of the West? Those are really interesting questions. I just want to, I think both as a substantive point and as a strategic point, it's worth noting that the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries were in fact not democratic, and that they don't fall easily on my definition of socialism with these two axes, because although they had very substantial state control of the economy, it wasn't democratic, and so it wasn't collective control in that sense. And so that's substantively important. Pragmatically, I think that if one ends up sounding like one is defending Stalin, then it's going to be really hard to convince anybody.
Yeah, that's true.
And I don't feel any stake in defending Stalin. I mean, of course, Stalin is not to be associated. He was one leader, but for a long time, and so I'm certainly less concerned about defending the Soviet bloc. But I think it is definitely worth noting, as I did, that things weren't as bad there as they're portrayed, and that's really interesting.
Right.
And in fact, once the collapse of the Soviet Union occurred, the Soviet bloc countries had a depression worse than ours in the 30s that they're still recovering from, which is, again, very, very odd on the capitalist claim that what you need to produce economic wealth and well-being are capitalist markets, because we introduced those in 1991 and their economy collapsed. Life expectancy went down. There was much more suffering. Now they're starting to crawl back out of that, but it took a long time, which is obviously kind of baffling on the capitalist hypothesis.
Right. Yeah, and of course, Kristen Gotze does really good work on this. Her book, Red Hangover, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, a lot of her work kind of focuses on examining what was the reality, not the cartoon version we get in the West, but what was the reality. And, of course, the differences between various socialist states, because there was high degrees of differences with regards to some of these metrics between different states. So I think that's certainly interesting. One of the things that happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, is that capitalism in the West became more rabid. I don't think it's a coincidence that neoliberalism and Clinton third wayism arose at the same time the Soviet Union, the main ideological and material perhaps challenger to the capitalist West, collapsed, that you get this hyper-capitalist era in the West where they're like, oh, we don't have any enemies right now, right? We can do whatever the fuck we want. And so those things are all very connected. But there is there's something beautiful in the idea and the early formation of the Soviets. I find like there's that possible seed of true democracy, the sort of thing that you're saying eventually was lacking in the system. The possibilities and the seeds were certainly there, and of course circumstances, historical weight, the past weighs on the present like a nightmare. All these things come into play, but there's indications, and I try to find those little gems, those little diamonds of possibility in these experiments. So, but I appreciate you going back and forth with me on that. I think it's a fascinating question, and this is sort of more inter-left disputes and conversations. But we should have them sober-mindedly and friendly and figure this stuff out, because that hyper-sectarianism and that angry vitriol infighting gets us absolutely nowhere. So
absolutely right.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move on to the next question, and this is about wealth inequality. And I think it's rather obvious, just looking around at the society I live in, that massive wealth inequality tears societies apart, undermines social cohesion, obliterates the basis for real democracy, and is a genuine threat to the long-term viability of any society. Capitalist apologists argue, of course, that we socialists are just jealous. We're just jelly. We wish we had what they had, Give us a yacht and we'll stop talking about Marx. But of course, I don't feel that way. So what are your thoughts and lines of argumentation with regards to wealth inequality and how it plays into this socialism versus capitalism debate?
Right. And I will say, just in defense of the capitalist reaction, before then trying to take it apart, is that it can look like jealousy. If you have, and mere jealousy, if you have a situation right now where you and your neighbor both make $50,000, and you're offered a situation where you make $75,000, but your neighbor now makes $150,000. The obvious question that the capitalists raise is, well, why would you want to be less? Surely you would choose the second scenario, even though it involves much greater inequality, because you're better off. You've got 75,000 rather than 50,000. And there is something to that. That's, to some extent, maybe some of it is envy, perhaps. On the other hand, one general point that obviously needs to be made about great degrees of wealth inequality is what economists call the diminishing marginal utility of money. By way of example, if you give me a chocolate bar, I will greatly appreciate it and eat it and gobble it up. If you give me a second one, I will like that too. I'll probably like it a little bit less than the first one. By the time you've given me a 12th chocolate bar to eat, I really don't even want it anymore. It would certainly bring a whole lot more pleasure to somebody else who hasn't had 11 chocolate bars to eat already. The chocolate bars have diminishing marginal utility. As you add more of them, the utility that they provide to the person that you're giving them to decreases. And money is like that as well, fairly obviously. If you give a young woman who is struggling to feed her kids and working a couple of part-time minimum wage jobs, if you give her $20,000, that will make a huge difference in her life. If you give Jeff Bezos another $20,000, he presumably won't even notice. It would be like a drop in the bucket for him.
And he just made $20,000 while you finished that sentence.
Undoubtedly, yes.
But go on.
So it seems like, that when the capitalists bring up these scenarios like I did at the beginning, wouldn't you rather have 75,000 and your neighbor have 150,000? Then, one question would be, well, wait, given the diminishing marginal utility of money, would we be better off if we made that closer to equal just because of the diminishing marginal utility of money? And I think there's certainly a case to be made for that. There might be reasons for allowing some inequality, but as you point out, that it does tear societies apart, the degrees of inequality that we have. And one of the I discuss in detail in the book, I draw on data from a number of sources, but there's in particular a couple of books by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett called The Inner Level and The Spirit Level, respectively, the two books. And they talk a lot about the evidence about inequality and its negative effects on people, negative effects on child well-being, on life expectancy, on mental illness, obesity, crime rates. All of that is correlated in a bad way with inequality. Inequality, especially in the extreme, is just toxic to us. And I think this, maybe it does have to do with the fact that our evolutionary ancestors, lived in highly egalitarian cultures. And we're just, we're not built to have, people like Jeff Bezos going around with the multiple yachts while we also then walk by homeless people on the street or are homeless ourselves. It just doesn't work well for us, and it goes deep into our psyche, and it makes us feel much more nasty about other people and more competitive in various ways that are just quite unfortunate.
I mean, if this is truly a melting pot in the country where we care about it, and Lady Liberty got a hand like this, she really loves us, then we really need to be like that. And it needs to be the black kids. If there's a white person who got money, then he need to help them. He need to help black kids, Mexican kids, Korean kids, whatever. But it need to be real. And it need to be before we all die, and then you say, oh, I made a mistake. We should have gave them some money. We really should have helped these folks. It's going to be too late. You know what I'm saying? And then that's when you got to pay your own karma. And that's when God make you punish, when God punishes you. Because I feel like, it's too much money here. I mean, nobody should be hitting lotto for $36 million and we got people starving in the streets. That is not idealistic. That's just real. That is just stupid. There's no way Michael Jackson should have, or whoever Jackson, should have $1,000,000 billion and then there's people starving. There's no way. There's no way that these people should own planes and their people don't have houses, apartments, shacks. drawers, pants.
What do you say to people that say, well, they earned it? Now you go out and you're earning it.
If they earned it, then I think that's good, and I think that they deserve it. But even if you earned it, you still owe. Because look at me, I don't have that mega money, but I feel guilty walking by somebody. I got to give them some mail. And if I know I got $3,000 in my pocket, I feel like it's wrong to give that person a quarter or $1. It's wrong. Only you know what you got in your pocket. And that's wrong. No matter what they do, if they take it and drink it, they take it and drink it. But, I mean, you got. You understand? And we all know how hard it is, and it's not about if you good or you bad. So since it's not about if you good or you bad, we know that because he don't got don't mean he was bad. Or don't mean he's a criminal, or don't mean he's crazy, or a drug addict, or none of that. It just means he don't got. And ain't it bad that you got 30? I mean, can you imagine somebody having $32 million? $32 million. And this person has nothing, and you can sleep. You can still go to the movies and then these are the type of people that get humanitarian awards. Millionaires. How can they be humanitarians? By the fact that they millionaires and there's so many poor people shows how unhumane they are. You know what I'm saying? And that bugs me. Not saying that when I'm never going to be rich, and you know what I'm saying? But I'm saying it's a struggle, and I think everybody deserves. And I think there's a way to pay these people. I think there is a way. It just takes to be revolutionary. And it takes to do something out of the ordinary. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that if we just said, okay, I got an idea. No more porno buildings. You know what I'm saying? Let's build houses. Or no more polo games. Let's build houses for poor people. You know what I'm saying? Or, look, okay, I know you're rich. I know you got $40 billion. But can you just keep it to one house? You only need one house. And if you only got 2 kids, can you just keep it to 2 rooms? I mean, why have 52 rooms and you know there's somebody with no room? It just don't make sense to me. It don't. And then these people celebrate Christmas. They got big trees, huge trees, all the little trimmings. Everybody got gifts, and then somebody's starving. And they're having a white Christmas. They're having a great Christmas, eggnog and the whole nine. That's not fair to me.
And so, yes, I think that by and large, there's very good empirical evidence that moving to a much more egalitarian distribution of resources will do much by way of improving overall human well-being.
Absolutely. And there's another element, too, of massive wealth inequality under capitalism, where it's like, are these people even deserving? Like, is it's not like these people are curing cancer, or you're making these huge technological leaps for humankind based on their pure brilliance. I mean, they fucking started PayPal. They figured out that we could do libraries online. Like, it's not, these aren't like brilliant, manifestations of Uber mention, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Although, and even those are at least ideas. I mean, starting Amazon, okay, it was actually understandably, from an economic perspective, from a market perspective, having books sold that way rather than you just get them mailed to you, maybe it's going to work, and then it's worked very well economically. But still, like you said, does that make Jeff Bezos worthy, deserving? But that's, even that level of actual entrepreneurship that's not where most of the wealth is. By some estimates that I've seen, 60% of wealth in our society is just simply inherited.
Absolutely.
That's just a matter of, I guess the conservatives can look at us and say, well, look, you should have chosen better parents. But otherwise, it's hard to figure out how it is that this wealth, that much of this wealth is in a sense naturally deserved. I mean, because that's in the background, because I want to say, yes, we should have much more egalitarian distribution of resources. In practice right now, that means much more egalitarian redistribution of resources, because we are so far from having an egalitarian distribution of resources now. Some people will, of course, object that, wait, but no, this is my money. You are taking it. I deserve it. I earned it. And it's worth noting, before getting into any details about that and how much, that they deserve and how much they would have managed to do without the rest of us providing societal infrastructure through our taxes, et cetera, but that a whole lot of that wealth was simply inherited. And the idea that you just deserve it just simply makes no sense in cases like that.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you take Jeff Bezos away right now, the Amazon, system, the workers, they'll continue to produce value. If you took away the workers, there's no more Jeff Bezos.
Yes.
And I think that speaks volumes in and of itself. And to your point about inheritance, you get to this point where once you have wealth inequality, once that ball is starting to roll, then yes, you begin to obliterate even the basis of the equality of opportunity that liberals love to talk about so much, by stratifying society such that the class you were born into becomes much more likely to be the class you're going to die in over time, as that wealth is sort of hoarded by a relatively small amount of people and then handed down to their families, like the people that own Walmart and are billionaires. All the kids of the guy who created the damn store are now living, rich beyond belief because they happen to have the right set of parents, and then were just handed a life of complete opulence and luxury, and somebody born like I was to just regular working class people in the middle of Omaha, Nebraska. There's nothing. It doesn't matter how smart I am or how much I produce or how much I contribute to my community. It means nothing. And then you also have the element of moving capital around, in financialized capitalist systems. Like, people that have capital move capital around, invest capital, make more capital. If you don't have capital, you're sort of locked out of the game of even being able to do that. And then, of course, you tax capital gains at, half the rate that you tax income and all the other absurdities that come from it. And finally, as I said in the question, the obliteration of democracy. Because wherever in history there is massive wealth inequality, there is instantaneously and simultaneously massive political inequality. You cannot have a functioning democracy in which there are these incredibly stratified tiers of some people who have yachts and mansions and own huge businesses and own the means of production, and other people who have to sell their bodies and time, rent them out to rich people just to be able to pay their bills. Democracy falls away, and that's what we're seeing in the U.S., which makes the whole Biden campaign particularly amusing when they're like, this is a fight for democracy. If we lose, democracy is done. And it's like, democracy's already been done. And it's because you guys, just like the Republicans, have obliterated it through your donor classes, through Citizens United, through PAC money, through insider trading, through all the corruption that occurs on both sides of the aisle. You've already destroyed democracy. Please don't condescend to us and tell us that not voting for you means that we're throwing democracy in the trash bin.
Well, I think we could lose democracy. Democracy, like most things, I think, comes in degrees.
Sure.
And you're quite right. The extreme forms of inequality that we have mean that there's so much more political influence for those who already have all the wealth. There's scary data about the degree to which policy decisions reflect the interests of actual numbers of voters, and it just reflects wealth, by and large. It could be even worse,
Sure.
And it is entirely possible that we will, at least for the moment, it does appear that our votes are counted in the literal sense of they count when they get counted when you go to the ballot box and you can elect a representative to Congress or to the Senate, which of course is itself very undemocratic given the very structure of it. But it could be worse. And so I do think it's worth trying to, preserve, but then much more so increase the level of democracy that we already have.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with that. Protecting voting rights, absolutely essential. Fighting back against Citizens United, absolutely essential. And again, your degree model comes in handy here because it's not black or white. It's not either or. It's degrees of democracy. And the U.S. has never been a bastion. It's never been the sort of democracy it pretends to be. It's always been very limited in scope, and people have fought and died to expand that scope. And if we just do it's all bullshit anyways and nothing is different, then I think we kind of do a disservice to the people who have struggled for those gains, as tentative as they are and as subject to recall as they are. Our job is not to just dismiss the whole fight, but to carry the fight forward, expand democracy, etc. So I totally agree with you.
Good. Yeah.
Let's go to the next question. This is another point about democracy, which we were talking about. and I think this goes a little deeper into this exact point. The U.S., of course, fancies itself a democracy, or at least, as libertarians and conservatives will remind us, a representative republic. And yet it is and always has been, very hostile to real democracy since its founding, and even to genuinely representative politics. For socialists of any stripe, democracy is a core aspect of our political program, as you and I both make clear. Moreover, real democracy would entail expanding it into the economic realm and into the workplace, which in and of itself would be a direct assault on capitalism. Can you discuss the debate around the issue of democracy versus markets in particular, with regards to argumentations by, Hayek and Friedman, etc., and your arguments in favor of socialism with regards to democracy?
Yes. And I think it's just as a background here, the term democratic socialism, I think to some on the right can sound like, well, we're just throwing the word democratic in there because we want to make clear that, no, we're not talking about Stalin. We're not talking about some sort of dictatorship or that sort of thing. And we still want it to be democracy, but it actually goes much further than that. We are talking about expanding the role of democracy, trying to improve it in various ways, but expanding it over the areas. So right now, we even staunch capitalists accept the value of democracy for traditional governmental functions, courts, police, basic infrastructure, education, usually national defense, all of these sorts of things. They think, they probably basically agree on those things with the Winston Churchill quote that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all of those others that have been tried from time to time. And so, they agree that we should do that for these sorts of things. Why? Well, presumably because at least part of the thought is that we'll all be better off when everyone who is affected by a decision at least has a voice in it, and where we try to make those voices reasonably equal. We benefit from the voices of everyone who is affected, and those people benefit, they have buy-in, that sort of thing. Presumably, that's sort of the argument for why we even have democracy for these standard governmental functions. But there's a realm where major decisions affecting millions of people are made in an entirely undemocratic way. As you mentioned with Jeff Bezos, if he makes decisions, he can affect multitudes of workers and the rest of us, for that matter, given his influence in society. And that's, I didn't get a vote on that. His workers didn't get a vote on that. And so what socialism, by saying more collective control of the economy, is saying is that, well, wait, it's not just things like arranging our courts and police and basic infrastructure where democracy should be valuable, but democracy, if we think it's valuable there, then presumably we should think, all things being equal, it should be valuable when we are making economic decisions. So we should bring democracy into the realm of the economic. And, unless there's some particular reason that we would think it would be better not to have democracy there, that for some reason letting Jeff Bezos run things exactly the way he wants to, even when his decisions affect multitudes of people, that's better for all of us. That's an argument. You mentioned Hayek and Friedman. They both make that sort of argument. They think that we will be better off not by allowing certain things to be democratic. When it comes to economic decisions, the claim is that by having the incentives and the free market, it will actually work out better for all of us when we have things done undemocratically. That people, because they have the economic incentive, they will make decisions that are better for them. They will be more careful about it when they have an interest involved, a direct interest. And if we're all making decisions that are better for each of us, then it will be better for everybody. That seems to be the thought. But that crucial thought, that last part, that if we each make decisions that are better for ourselves, that it will generate a decision that is better for everyone, that's highly questionable in at least many, many cases. You can have Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk get together and make some decision that's really great for them, for both of them. They both walk away thinking this was the right thing to do, but it might be a whole lot worse for the rest of us. Mm-hmm. So that's the question. That's the tension, that we all generally, at least within the main part of the political spectrum, think that democracy is a good thing in general. And then the question is, well, why not expand it more into the realm of the economic. The capitalists have some reasons there, but I don't think they hold up by and large.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And of course, the Marxist response to this idea that by freely choosing in your own self-interest, you create an environment where everybody benefits, is that it completely ignores, as you were sort of alluding to, the core contradiction of capitalism, which is that there's this contradiction between bosses and workers, right? The boss wants to maximize profits by the very nature of the system and the competitive market that he's in. He needs to maximize profits, and the worker wants to maximize wages, to take home to their family. And so those two things are irreconcilable, and you can't just have, as you said, Musk and Bezos or whatever making decisions that then are, put out and everybody benefits. Absolutely not. The more profit a boss accumulates, the less that the workers get. And the more wages and the more union activity workers have, the more of a threat to profits they become. And the boss is going to try to fight tooth and nail, as we see Bezos doing, as we see Musk doing, as we see all these capitalists doing, to prevent the formation of unions, to prevent the rise of wages. And that's one reason why, in a society like ours, where our political system is largely captured by corporate interests, the minimum wage hasn't risen in decades, while productivity is shot through the roof, CEO pay is shot through the roof, every other metric that should be tied to wages has gone up and up and up, and yet wages remain nationally at a $7.25 an hour. I mean, that is despicable. That is pennies, and that is unlivable. And even I remember 10 years ago, we were fighting for a $15 minimum wage. That has now been surpassed, and that isn't even not even a living wage anymore for most people in most places. And we don't even have that yet. So I just want to kind of add that on top of your great argument. Let's go ahead and move forward, because, a core contradiction of capitalism, in my opinion, is this contradiction between the ideological commitment to free and competitive markets versus the reality of monopoly formation. The best thing any capitalist could achieve is, of course, cornering and dominating a given market. In today's epicenter of global capitalism, the United States, almost every industry and every slice of the market is dominated by monopolies or some sort of shared monopoly, or a very small handful of corporations which more or less can collude and often do collude to fix prices, gouge prices, etc. All of these things undermine competitiveness and annihilate free markets. Like, no scrappy startup is going to displace Amazon, right? Nobody's going to displace Google. You can't have this entrepreneurial free market, early Reagan era idea of the shopkeeper competing in a free and open marketplace at the same time that you have every industry dominated by these sort of monopolistic forces. So can you but the right, of course, continues to argue that free markets are essential, and what we have is free markets, and any attempt to, even trust bust is met with these arguments about, the necessity of free markets, which just drives me crazy. But can you talk about the tendency toward monopoly under capitalism and the pressures it puts on these capitalist lines of argumentation about free markets?
Yes, right. Yeah, good question. Yes. There is this basic idea, but it sounds reasonable what the capitalists say initially, that the profit motive and rational consumers will continue to create pressure and for ever better products at better prices. If I sell widgets for $5 and someone can come along and make equally good widgets but sell them for $3, then they'll gain bigger market share, and I will either have to improve my product or drop out of the market, and it'll just keep getting better and better for everyone. There will still be profits because that's what's driving the system, but it'll get better and better for the consumer. The very idea behind capitalism, or at least the most reasonable argument for it, is that market competition will be better for everyone because it will drive more productivity, better products, better mousetraps. It will all beat a path to the door of whoever makes one. But as you quite correctly note, the profit motive also means that by far the best thing I can do as a capitalist is to somehow corner the market and be the only one selling widgets and drive anybody else that tries to sell widgets out of business. And then I don't have to worry about competition, and I can charge much higher prices. And reasonable people on the capitalist side will acknowledge that when this happens, the very rationale for the benefits of capitalism has been undermined, that it is, or at least they should. People like Hayek and Friedman did acknowledge that. They nonetheless tend to be critical of the idea that we should do much of anything about it at the governmental level. They have some tendency to think that collective democratic action to break up monopolies or try to set things up such that they don't happen is going to inevitably be worse. But it is an odd position, and I don't really understand it. Once things are tending towards a monopoly, we've lost the reason that one might have thought that markets are such a great thing. And so why wouldn't we come in and try to structure things such that that doesn't happen or break it up when it does? I think at that point, I do think there are intelligent capitalists out there and that are not necessarily greedy and immoral. They might be greedy, but not necessarily immoral. They might genuinely think it's the best system for everyone. And there's something to be said for this idea that the market will produce better goods for everyone. But in the face of monopolies, to say, oh, yeah, well, we shouldn't do anything about monopolies, when that undermines the very rationale for why capitalist markets are supposed to be a good thing, then it seems to me that at that point it's devolved into a bizarre faith in economic markets that's no longer based on any reasonable premise or plausible empirical reality. And so, so your basic question is, why do they say these sorts of things? I don't know. In the end, I mean, I think in the end, I think they start with some kind of reasonable premise. Once gets pressure put on it, they just evolve into some sort of faith that markets are good and government is bad. Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981 when the inauguration happened and said that government is not the solution, government is the problem. And that's become not for any reasons anymore, but just become a faith on the part of some of these on the neoliberal right. And and we can do our best to try to point that out. And but it does seem hard to get through to them on that sort of issue.
Yeah, my best theory for this is that each side of this debate sort of triggers a certain ideological thing for them. So, of course, there's the free markets and monopoly, and you think rationally, okay, monopolies are anti-free market, they're anti-competitive, etc. We should break these up for the sake of your ideology of free market capitalism. But the moment you start talking like that, and you alluded to this with Hayek and Friedman, well, the solutions involve government coming in and imposing itself over people who have property rights, and that triggers their other ideological commitment of being against that in every facet. And so while on one hand there's this contradiction that they, in its own realm of discourse and thinking could lead them to be like, yeah, we need more free markets, we need to trust bus. The actual implementation of the policies necessary to do that involve government stepping in and, basically pushing back against this idea that you have a right to whatever, your property. Jeff Bezos started Amazon, and Amazon is super successful. We're not going to punish success. And so they get caught in this back and forth. They're rarely ever forced to hold both those ideas at once in public. It's one or the other. And if you try to pin them down and say, okay, well, this leads to this, and then there's this, which is against what you said over here, I mean, that's never going to happen on CNN and Fox News. But it would be interesting to see them have to sort of wiggle out of that and have to sit with that contradiction. But it's not going to likely happen anytime soon. But let's go ahead and move on. We're getting towards the end here. I've really enjoyed this conversation. This is really fun. But in your last chapter, Market Failures 3, you advance the idea of a neighborhood effect, with climate change, of course, being the prime example of such an effect. Can you elaborate on this idea of the neighborhood effect and argue why socialism is a superior form of socio-economic organization, especially in this regard?
Yes. First of all, I did actually borrow the term neighborhood effect from Milton Friedman.
Nice.
It's often called a negative externality, but that sounds so technical externality as if, I don't know. It's hard to, it sounds technical and not very informative. A neighborhood effect, the idea is that if I own a factory and I decide to make widgets or whatever, and then I do it in a way in which I pollute the local river that then goes downstream and kills fish and harms people and that sort of thing. But you buy my widgets and so we have our transaction. I made my widgets, you buy them. That's, and we each think we're better off. Otherwise, we wouldn't have both made the deal. But people in the neighborhood are harmed by this process because their water has been polluted and all sorts of things have happened. So the basic idea of a neighborhood effect is that, yes, you have your principal actors in any given economic exchange, but people in the neighborhood of that exchange might also be affected, even though they weren't the ones that made any decision there. And that's a big problem for capitalist arguments, that because the basic idea behind why markets are supposed to work for all of us is that if we each go into a transaction and we do voluntarily consent to make some purchase, some economic transaction, that if we're doing it voluntarily and rationally and with our eyes open, then we must each walk away with something better. And if we just keep multiplying that, that's what the economy is, everybody making decisions that are better for them, then surely it's better for everyone. That's the idea. But neighborhood effects, that a number of those decisions can be such that no, people not involved in the direct economic transaction are deeply harmed by this. And that's something that capitalism can't easily handle by itself. You need to have some way, if you want to maximize well-being, then when economic transactions start to have negative neighborhood effects, we need some other way of dealing with that other than just more economic transactions. We need to set things up through government, something to do that. And as I mentioned in the book, I talked this hypothetical example about pollution, but the big one, obviously, now is climate change. That we are doing all kinds of economic transactions that, are in the interest of the individual actors. If you want to see your mother who lives in California, and it's a whole lot, and somebody else wants to sell you a ride on a plane to get there, the person selling you the ride on the plane, and, so the airline and you walk away from the transaction both feeling better off. It's all been good for you, but of course, you've also burned a lot of fossil fuels in the process. And so many of our economic transactions these days involve fossil fuels and burning them, and it's cheap. It provides prosperity and well-being in a lot of ways, but there's this catch. There's this neighborhood effect, namely the neighborhood being the entire planet and what we are doing to it and what we are doing to its climate and what effects that will have on everyone, and especially on future generations of people who are obviously not parties to the economic transactions that are leading to this. And so climate change ends up being, World Bank chief economist, who was chief economist at the time, Nicholas Stern, referred to climate change as the greatest example of market failure we have ever seen. And I take it what he means by that is that it's, and he said that back in, I think, 2008, and things have only gotten more extreme and more obvious since then. It's a market failure because it's a case where what seems economically rational to each party involved in the transaction can be disastrous for lots of other people and for future generations. And I don't see a capitalist way out of that. It seems like that's where we need collective control to try to mitigate these effects, to try to rearrange things such that we are no longer destroying the environment on which we all survive and on which future generations will rely, that we need to protect that, even if it comes at the cost of getting involved in economic transactions where each person making the transaction thinks this is great for me. Because what's great for me is not necessarily what's great for everyone.
Yeah, incredibly well said. Another, of course, a great example of the modern times is the microplastic epidemic that we're only just now beginning to understand. as a classic example of this exact neighborhood effect. The cheapness of plastic in production results in this sort of, deleterious effect on the environment and our bodily health. Like the microplastics are in our bodies right now, and we're not exactly sure what that means. It could be better or worse than some people imagine, but in any case, it is this problem where, nobody signed up for this, and yet we're all swimming in it. And also, comparing it not just to present human beings suffering, but to the future, I think is a really important dynamic of this discussion, because future human beings, we are responsible to them. And we have to bake that into our rationale of how we organize society, that we want to hand future generations better societies and, advance the ball for future human beings. And when we're destroying the planet for short-term profit and gain, we're doing the exact opposite. And the last thing I'll say is on your point about externality, negative externality. One, it's a technical term. It sounds jargony. It sort of obscures more than it illuminates. But also, I think dialectically, from my perspective, nothing is external. We live on this little snow globe in outer space, and there is no external. Everything is connected, and everything, of course, is internal in some sense. So that's another reason why I absolutely hate that term externality. But
yes,
neighborhood effect is much better.
Yes.
All right, we have about 8 more minutes or so, and I know you don't have a sharp deadline here. I want to pop one bonus question at you before we get into the conclusion. And I think I touched on this a little bit earlier. An argument that I've had is you often hear defenders of capitalism, liberals as well as conservatives, use this line that, what we support as liberals and capitalists is the equality of opportunity. And what these socialists represent is what they want is equality of outcome. And, we don't believe in equality of outcome. We believe in equality of opportunity. And my argument to that has always been to turn that around and say, first of all, equality of outcome is sort of incoherent. I don't even know what that would mean. There's a material realm to outcomes where people are taken care of, but also there is this inbuilt differences in people, right? Some people are funnier than others. Some people are more athletic than others. Some people are better painters or singers than others. And you're never going to, nor do we want to as socialists, iron out those wrinkles of humanity. That diversity of ability and talent and interests is fascinating. We just don't think that it should result in enormous wealth inequality, right? Just because you're a good businessman doesn't mean you're now entitled to the labor of 1 million people, their surplus value, 10 houses, and political systems. And so what my argument is that what socialists represent is equality of opportunity. There is no equality of outcome. That's sort of an incoherent idea. Socialists believe in truly equality of opportunity. We were talking about inheritance earlier, about choosing your parents, how unjust that very idea is. And so we want to build a society where people genuinely have equal opportunity to express themselves, to live their lives, to find their talents and their interests and their ways of contributing to the whole, and to advance those without worrying about sleeping in the gutter, without worrying about whether or not they're going to be able to get their cancer treatments because they don't have enough, zeros in their bank account. And actually, liberals and capitalists, they don't believe in equality of outcome. They also don't believe functionally in the equality of opportunity, because the entire system that they represent is directly hostile to true equality of opportunity. Go to a poor black neighborhood, look at the funding that public school gets compared to a wealthy white suburban neighborhood, and that public school, how well that's funded, what the ratio teachers to students are, etc. And you'll see immediately that there's no such thing, and there never has been, of equality of opportunity in liberal capitalist society. So I'm wondering if that argument resonates with you, and if you have anything to add.
Yeah, absolutely. That resonates tremendously. Yeah, I think you're quite right on the equality of outcome. That's it's not even clear exactly what that would mean. We go for socialism, as I was defining it too, but certainly traditionally involves a more egalitarian distribution of resources. That's not, as far as I'm concerned, or it's certainly for me, but I think even historically, it's not that was ever an end in itself, that we just want equality of resources. Everybody should just be equal, and especially like you say, and if you run faster than somebody else, then we're going to cut you off at the knees. There was this, something like it. No, nobody's ever said, that's never been the point. The point is not equality or even egalitarian distribution of resources. That's not an end in itself. The end in itself is human well-being, is people being better off and happier and having more meaningful, fulfilling lives. And if we can get to that through more egalitarian redistribution or distribution of resources, then that's what we should do. That's what motivates, I take it, the socialist project of working in that direction. And that's what we, we should be open to the possibility. It is an empirical claim to say that more egalitarian distribution of resources leads to greater human well-being. That's not something that is just a priori, as philosophers put it. It's not something that you can just know from your armchair, but the empirical data support it. That's what we've seen and we've talked about earlier in this podcast even. But that's the issue is we're concerned about human well-being, not with, and so it's just an unfair characterization of socialists to say that we're just after equality of outcome. But I also think you're right that if the capitalist says, we believe in equality of opportunity, if you just held their feet to the fire on that and said, really, okay, and apart from the obvious thing of inheritance, of simply inheriting huge amounts of wealth, yes, it's just the differentials go so much deeper because the schooling, like you say, the quality of the schools, the quality of the neighborhoods, we are so far from having anything that looks like genuine equality of opportunity. I almost sort of feel like, if you could just, you get the conservatives to agree that equality of opportunity is really, really important, and then just say, okay, now let's sit down and talk about what that means and why things are going to have to change pretty drastically before we can have that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I actually heard Ted Cruz say that exact argument once, and I'm like, I just started laughing and kind of puked in my mouth a little bit, but
he can lead to that response.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Just looking at him. Okay, so for the final question, can you kind of just summarize the conclusion of your book? Of course, as I said at the outset, we're never going to be able to capture an entire book in 10 questions. I highly, highly encourage people that are interested in arming themselves with this sort of methodical, systematic, logical argumentations to get the book, to check it out, to learn from it, spread it around, etc. If you're in an organization, get it and pass it around your organization, whatever. It really is incredibly helpful because, the ideological, rhetorical debate is one of the struggles on the terrain of political struggle. And we have to meet our opponents on that terrain as well as other terrains. And I think Scott does a wonderful job at giving us more tools in our toolbox. But can you please summarize the conclusion of your book and let listeners know where they can find you and your work online?
Okay. Yes. Well, I mean, in a way, there are two aspects of the conclusion of the book. One is almost methodological, and the other is substantive and where we should go from there. And so I'll start with the methodological side of that what I do, as I mentioned at the outset, and as has probably become somewhat apparent through the conversation, is, I try to break down arguments and really look at what it is that people are assuming and what they are inferring from those. I do this over and over in the book and break them down into these numbered steps. Saying, what's a premise, what's the inferences, and once we've identified the premises, then we can say, okay, so what's the argument for that premise? And does the empirical data support it? Is it an empirical premise? Is it a moral premise? And we can have further arguments about that. This method, this sort of breaking down arguments into their component parts to analyze them, I think is fundamentally very important for understanding our own positions, understanding our opponents, and perhaps changing our minds about various things. That these arguments, I mean, a lot of people's time, some will eschew sort of arguments and just want, our polarized society, people will just say whatever their camp says and then just shout it louder if somebody gives them some sort of contrary message. And I think that's unfortunate. I think that we should be paying attention to arguments and reasons. These are the skeleton. They're the framework of our beliefs. And just like you wouldn't be able to walk very well if your femurs were broken, you can't think very well if your arguments are broken, if you don't have reasons behind your conclusion. There's this wonderful quote that I like from A.E. Housman, or at least it's a lead quote. I'm not sure that he actually said it, but he said that a moment's thought would have shown him, but a moment is a long time, and thought is a painful process. And the idea behind that is that, it's, or at least the way I'm reading into that, is that it's a whole lot easier to just spout the views that your camp thinks are correct and to abuse the other side. It's a lot more productive and a lot more interesting and fun in the end, although Hausman's right, it is difficult. It's to figure out your actual reasons and to push further and to do more analysis. And I think if we had much more of that, that would at least try to put some brakes on the increasing and unfortunate polarization in our political debates as far as that goes. So that's on the methodological side. The substantive side, when I look at the arguments, when I look at the evidence and present them and what I think is a perfectly fair way, I think it shows that we should move strongly left in the direction of socialism. We should have much more by way of egalitarian distribution of resources. We should have much more democratic collective control over major economic decisions. By doing these things, we will make people better off. We will make them happier. We will make them have more meaningful, fulfilled lives. We won't be violating the moral rights of individuals. And that's what we should do. As far as where they can find me, I do have a website, scottsehon.com, and it has links to the book, a sample chapter, and some occasional links to podcasts that I've done, link to a debate that I did with Libertarian Brian Kaplan, so various other things. Also pictures that I've taken with my drone, because I do that sometimes too.
Cool. Beautiful. Yes, I will link the book and your website in the show notes for people to further their investigation.